So today, again, I have a super exciting rebuild for you. Because I don't know about you, but in the past few days, I've seen a lot of tweets about this new carousel on Stripe's session page. It's a carousel that features all of the different speakers of their event. And when you hover it, you see that the speaker you're hovering kinda expands a little bit, and when you click it, it slides out. You can go to the next one, and they even added some looping functionality in here, so you see the one from the right side popping in again, and it feels really, really smooth. And that is something that I want to replicate today. And we are going to do that with Tailwind. So if I quickly jump over to the frontendfyi website, or the development version that is, you actually see the final result that I built. And this page is still in development because you see there's a video here that's not correct. But for now, we're going to focus on the end result. And this tool is something you can experiment with yourself pretty soon as well. But the end result I made is something where exactly the same animations are in there. And if you open it, you see all the different items. The thing we didn't build though is the real carousel functionality, so stuff loops. And there's new items added from the right side, simply because I think building your own carousel is not really something you should do. Carousels probably aren't the best accessible thing either, and I'm not here to teach you how to build a really great carousel. But what I do want to teach you is how these animations work and how you simply can make things look really, really smooth. So that is what we'll be focusing on today. And for that, we have to switch over to an empty version of this project, which is this thing. In here, there's not much yet. I added one div that actually helps us center everything in the middle, but that's just so everything looks pretty and it doesn't really add any functionality to the page here. On top of that, I've also added a persons file, and I already installed dependency class names because I know we're gonna need that. Inside that persons file, there's actually only an array that contains the image, the title, and the name of the speaker. And this is just put in different files, so we don't have to look at it that much, and we can just import it and use it right away. So to start things off, I think we need to add this data in here. And because looking at Stripe's page again, it's a list of speakers in this case, that means that semantically we have to use an unordered list. So if we add this unordered list in there, we can actually, like Copilot suggests already, map over the different persons and render list items for each of them. In this case, I'm gonna render a list item with, for now, the person.name in there. Also, because we're looping in React, we need to add a key, which could also be the person.name. And this already gives us all of the different names. And of course, we still need to give this a display flex, which will put everything horizontally on one line. Next to that, it's also smart if we start adding a wrapper around this, which would be some sort of page container. So for now, we can give this fixed width. So let's do that by adding another div that has a class name. And in this case, for example, a width of 1200 pixels and the max width of full. So on mobile, it won't grow beyond the width of the window. And on top of that, we can already add, for example, a gap of 2. So everything is spaced out a bit more. And once we've done that, we can already start giving this thing a specific width. Let's start off by giving them a fixed width. In this case, let's go for 8%. And I'm also gonna add a gray background to our list items so we can see a bit better what we're doing. Then I'm gonna give this carousel a fixed height of 640 pixels. And we can already give this list item rounded to XL. And now we've done this, we already see that we kinda have the same blocks. One thing missing, of course, is the width of an active item. And that active item, for now, I actually want to suggest to put this in state. So we create an active item and set active item, and for example, set that to 4. So this active item is then the index in the array that is actually the active item. And based on this, we're actually gonna set a aria attribute, aria-current equals active item And then we need to have the index of the loop equals index. So this way, as soon as the active item is equal to the index of the current person we're mapping through, we are going to set this aria-current to true. And if we inspect our carousel, we can also see that there's currently one item that has aria-current. And based on that aria attribute, we can then give the active item a different width. Styling on the aria-current attribute in Tailwind is something you need to do with the arbitrary values. And these arbitrary values look like square brackets, or they start with square brackets. And in this case, we actually want to target this exact same element. And we can do that by adding an ampersand in there. And then, like in normal CSS, we can select based on an attribute. And attributes also have square brackets in CSS. So that means that we get another square bracket in here. And then we can say aria-current equals true, which selects this element only if it has aria-current is true. And then we can say colon with 48%. And you immediately saw that it applied the right styles. So right now, the active element has a width of 48%. And if we change this to 3, for example, we see that the other element gets the right width. And I am, by the way, using the aria-current attribute because this is the attribute that gives, when there's multiple elements in the same container and one of them is active, that actually tells the screen reader which element is then the active one. And we're not building something that's fully accessible in this video because that would be a whole different topic. But because it's an attribute available and because it's doing the right thing here semantically, that's what I chose to use instead of, for example, an attribute, a data attribute, or any other class. One thing that is still missing from the carousel though is these first elements. They are actually really small. You also cannot click them, and as soon as you move, it will add the next one. That adding is not something we're gonna add, but I want to make the first and last items very small as well. And with Tailwind, that's actually pretty easy to do. We can just say first colon with 1%, and we can also do last colon with 1%. And I'm also gonna add an overflow hidden, so for now the text won't leak outside of the carousel item. And then I think it is time to make things look just a little bit nicer. And what better way to do that than adding in the pictures? So let's add an image tag where we add the source of person.image. I also add an alt tag of person.name. And it should actually be img instead of image. And doing that already gives us some nice images. And of course, looking at Stripe's images, you see that they have a gradient ready in the background and they are all perfectly gray and freestanding with nothing weird in the background. I don't want to use these pictures, so I just looked a few up on Unsplash. But one thing we can already do is make them grayscale as well. That already brings us a little bit towards the end result. Then we're also going to make them width full and height full. That will stretch them, but we can simply fix that by adding object cover, which will fill them to their available space. And that's already looking pretty good. And now we did that, I think it's time to add some hover effects. And then looking again at Stripe's image, as soon as you hover any image, you see that all of the other images get smaller as well. And the one you're hovering actually becomes a little bit larger. So let's take this step by step. The first thing I want to do is just make them become a little bit bigger on hover. And for that, we could add hover with 12%, which Tailwind moves to the end. But as soon as you do that and we hover the images, we see that they become larger. Of course, we should still add a transition for that as well. Transition width. And we need to add that in square brackets because by default, Tailwind does not support width as a transition because it's not auto accelerated. But doing this with scale would become way more complicated. And I think in this case, the impact the width transition has is pretty limited because it's quite isolated and doesn't influence the whole page. So if we do that, we already see that they animate. However, what also should happen is that all of the other ones shrink a little bit. So that way it doesn't push everything out, but the total width the carousel takes in will remain the same. And in order to make sure you can see this properly, I'm actually gonna add in the class names package now. And then I'll take out this hover and add it on a new line. Class names in this case will just merge them together, but I think for readability right now, it's good to have them on a separate line so you can see better. So it's easier to see what's happening here. To add this hover effect, that when you hover the carousel, all of the other ones shrink in size, there's a really neat trick you can use with Code Sandbox. And that trick is called the group selector. How that works is you add a class name called group to the parent, in this case our unordered list, and then we can say group hover width of, for example, 7%. And then if we hover them, you see that all of them become 7%. It doesn't matter which one we hover, as long as we hover the parent, all of the children get scaled down. However, this gives us a few issues. Let's just tackle them one by one. First, the one we're currently hovering shouldn't shrink down because it's actually growing because of the hover selector. However, because in Tailwind everything is the same specificity, this currently does not override the other one, simply because probably this is later in the generated CSS. So that means we need to make this group hover a little bit smarter. And this might look complicated, but I think if we go step by step, hopefully it starts to make sense. What we can do is prefix this with an arbitrary selector and then add in the ampersand to target the current list item. And then we say not : hover. So in this case, oh, and we need to add a colon here as well. So in this case, what this selects is this list item, but only if it's not hovered. And then it will get triggered by the group hover. So that means that if we right now hover one item, it will still grow because the new selector does not apply. And there's actually a few more it should not apply to. And we can simply concatenate them together with a comma. Another one is ampersand not first. And the same thing we should do for the last item. Because all of these actually should not grow or shrink. And if we now hover every slide, we see that it's still jumping around a bit. There's a few reasons for this. The first one is that we added a gap of 2, which is actually too small to fill the full width because all of the percentages should actually add up to 100%. So in this case, it should actually be 1.5%. That already makes everything a bit bigger and makes sure that the full width is filled. But there's one more issue with this, because if we move, you see that things are still jumping around a little bit. And the reason is because there's actually this gap. And this gap is actually not hovering any of the list items because it's a gap in between them. So that means that when you move your cursor from one to the other, there's a brief moment when nothing is hovered and everything actually wants to transition back into its original position. Maybe you already guessed it, of course there's a fix for this. And that fix actually works with a pseudo element. And for that, just for readability, I'm gonna add a new line so you can follow along a bit better. So first let's add this element and then I'll show you what it does. We're gonna add a before element with a background of red 300 in this case. We're gonna make this before top 0, before bottom 0, and then before left minus 10 pixels, and before right also minus 10 pixels. And if we then make this before absolute, which means that we should make the parent relative, otherwise it becomes absolute to the page, and we remove this overflow hidden, then we see that there's now these red lines. And these red lines are actually extending those 10 pixels beyond the slide itself. And the trick is, these still will trigger the hover effect of the list item because they're children of the list item. So right now, even if we move on top of this red piece, it will still trigger and it will just go from one to the other. And we already see that everything moves without the other ones jumping around. They only all jump around when we hover this because all of them become just a little bit smaller. So because we don't need to see those red lines, we can just make them white or transparent for that matter. And because we just now had to remove the overflow hidden so this pseudo element works, I actually need to add another wrapper div around our image. Because this way we can add a new overflow hidden to this div as well. But first we need to make them width full and height full, so everything is the correct size again. Then we're also gonna add the rounded to XL to this div instead of the list item. And that way everything again looks exactly the same. There is still one thing that annoys me when hovering this though. If I hover this image, for example, you see that the one that's currently active, the image kind of jumps around. Because if you look at her eyes, they will slightly go down as well. And the reason is because this image changes its size, but it still needs to keep this object cover so everything is filled in the square. And because of that, the image kind of moves around and it looks a little bit ugly, I think. So what we need to do to fix that is make sure that the image does not change in proportions. And that's actually another reason that I added this div right now, because this way we can make our image position absolute. Because if we make this position absolute, and then I'm also going to add a width and height to the image, as well as in the CSS, add the same width of 590 pixels and height of 640 pixels. And then we're gonna make the parent position relative. And then we're gonna center this image by giving it the left half and top 50%, and then offsetting it with minus translate x 50% and minus translate y of 50%. Then the images look the same again. There's one more thing though we still need to change, and that is also make sure that they don't have a max width. And as soon as we do that and hover this image, we see that her eyes stay in the exact same place. And that is because the image always has the exact same dimensions. So if we inspect this image, for example, we see that it's actually just a little bit wider. And if we inspect the other image, then we see that it's always a big version of the image, and it's right now just showing the centerpiece of the image. And this way, when we hover the images, we don't see them jumping around. They will only just reveal themselves. And that's what makes this animation so peaceful. So in order to test that properly, next we just have to add an on-click handler, so it will go from one slide to the other slide. And for that, there's not a lot we have to add, because we already added this set active item from the state. So that means that if we add an on-click, and again, this is not the accessible proof way to do it, but for this demo, I think it will suffice. So if we add this on-click, then we can set the active item equal to the index. And that way, as soon as we click, we see that the image grows. Amazing. This already looks really beautiful. Looking at the end result though, there are still a few things we have to add. The first one is, you see that this animation actually looks different. However, the animation when we hover is exactly the same. And that is because the Stripe team did something really interesting. When you switch a slide, they temporarily change the animation so it moves way slower and way smoother. But they didn't want to have that animation when you hover one of these cards. But because they are exactly the same element, they kind of share the same transition value. However, they came up with something really smart for this. What they did is, as soon as you switch an image, they temporarily set a CSS variable on the list of the carousel. And this variable then contains the transition that they wanted to use. And that is what we're going to replicate right now. So the first thing we have to add for this is a use effect. And this use effect is then listening to a change in the active item. So as soon as the item changes, it's expecting to do something. And what it's expecting to do is setting this CSS variable. In order to do that, we first need to have a ref to this unordered list, because that way we can target the element and set some inline styles. So let's create a new variable called wrapper_ref, which is useRef that takes in the HTML unordered list element and starts with null. Now we have this wrapper, we can add it to the unordered list, and then we can do something with it in this effect. First, if we do not have a wrapper ref, we return, because then there is nothing we can set a style on. So in this case, we shouldn't do anything. But if there is, I want to add a CSS variable to it. And we can do that by running wrapperref.current.style.setProperty, where the name of this property will become a CSS variable. In this case, we name it transition. And the value will be a super nice cubic Bezier transition. If we go back to our carousel and we inspect this unordered list, you see that it already added this transition. But that doesn't do anything yet, because we don't use it. However, using this CSS variable isn't that complicated. First, I'm going to take out this default width transition, and again, I'm going to add this onto a new line. But instead of having transition width, we are now going to use square brackets and then say transition colon, and in there we are going to add this transition variable. And this will actually simply render a CSS property called transition with the value of this CSS variable, which in this case is 600 milliseconds and the cubic Bezier. So that means that we can remove this width, but it also means that we still need to add the width to our new transition. Plus, on top of this, we should actually still have a default that is applied when this transition variable is not set. Because, like I said, it should only be applied when you're switching between different slides and not when you're simply hovering a specific slide. So instead of having this applied always, we're actually gonna need to remove this in a second as well. So that means that we need to add a default into our CSS variable. Luckily, that's not super complicated because you can add that as a second argument to the variable. That second argument, we are gonna make 200 milliseconds and ease in. Of course, I should not make a typo because it should be transition. And then you already see that this smooth transition is applied. And also when we click on it, it animates really smooth. But like I said, it shouldn't be applied when we are hovering one of these different items. So that means that when we're setting this property, we should actually also remove it once this change has been completed. We need to set a timeout inside our update to also remove this again after, for example, 900 milliseconds. And this then runs the wrapperref.current.remove property transition. So that way, if we inspect our list item again, we see that there's nothing on there right now. And if we hover, we have the default ease transition. But when we click, it temporarily adds the transition and then removes it. So this way, this new transition is only applied when we are hovering. There is again one small but with using a timeout within a use effect, because this could run multiple times and that could then set multiple timeouts. So in order to fix this, we should actually create a timeout ref, which is a use ref, and it takes in either number or null and has as a default value null. And then we can check if there is a timeout ref.current, then we clear timeout the current timeout. Because this way, if the effect runs again, we clear any previous timeout that has been set. But this timeout ref right now doesn't have any value yet, so we should assign our current timeout to this value. Then there is one more thing we need to do, which is actually also return a cleanup function. And that cleanup function, thank you Copilot, also checks if there is currently a timeout running, and if so, it will clear it for us. So that way we will never run into the problem of having multiple timeouts running and then clearing each other at weird times that we actually do not want. So looking at the carousel, we still see that it's applied at the right moment, but it's not applied when we hover them. Beautiful. The next thing we still need to do is don't render the image on the first item. And like you can see, also do not trigger any hover on them. And that we can fix by adding some more styles. We can say first pointer events none and also last pointer events none, because this case it will not trigger any hover over them because they don't accept any pointer events. And that's actually a lot easier than needing to change our onClick handler to also check which index you clicked. This way we can just do it with CSS. And next we can select the image within our list item, but only if it's the first item, and give that an opacity of 0. And we also do exactly the same thing with the last image. But what you see is that it's now white instead of the gray background the slides had. And that is because our background is added to the list item instead of our wrapper div. But that list item now has the pseudo before element with a white background lying on top of it. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove this gray background and move it to our wrapper div. And in this case, you see that we only see the gray background for the first and the last image. And that pretty much sums up the whole animation of this carousel. There's two more things missing, which is a gradient on top of the active image, as well as, of course, the title. For this gradient, I actually already prepared a little bit because I don't want to make this video too long. But what you can see is this simply adds two different pseudo elements, a before and an after, which are positioned absolutely. And then inside the Tailwind config, you can find that I've added a background image that is simply a PNG, and next to that adds a radial gradient on top of it. And then I added a conditional clause, which helps to only show this gradient if the active item is equal to the current index, and makes it opacity 25%, and otherwise it's not visible at all. And if you then click these different items, you see that the purple color fades in. And finally, we should still add a div that holds the name and the title of the speaker. So first let's add two paragraphs with person.title and also a new paragraph with person.name. Then we're gonna make this position absolute and give this a left of 8 and a top of 8. And for the title, we're gonna give it a text of large, make this uppercase, and give this a color of text primary. For the name, we are actually gonna make this text to XL, or actually even 4XL, and make it font bold as well. And then this should only be visible for the active speaker. So that means that we need to add another conditional clause based on whether it's the active item or not. That we can do again by adding class names. And then we're gonna say if active item is equal to the index, then we're gonna give this a translate x of 0 and an opacity of 100. Otherwise, it will get a translate x of 3, 4, and the opacity of 0. And of course, we should still add a transition on that just to make it look a bit nicer, which is transition of transform and opacity. And we should also give this a fixed width, because if we don't do it, and we're right now looking at this slide and I click it, you see that the text kind of jumps around. And that is because it's wrapping to the new line when it gets smaller. So we can simply say width of 590 pixels, because that way it will always stay in place. It will just fade in and fade out. And that actually concludes the desktop version of this carousel. The only thing we still need to add is a responsive breakpoint to also make this work on mobile. Because again, looking at Stripe's example, and then we're going to mobile, we see that they're actually just putting them on different lines right underneath each other. So that's still something we also need to add. And it means that most of the things we actually did apply right now need to be applied only from medium and up. Because that way, if we go smaller, it will go to a mobile version. So the first thing we need to do is make this a flex column, which puts everything underneath each other. You don't see it yet, but trust me. And also make this a flex row on medium and up again. Then this fixed height should also only apply from medium and up. And all of these different widths for the list item should also only be applied on medium, because on mobile, they all should be full width. So that means that all of these should become medium prefixed as well. Same goes for the transition on width, because we don't want to see a transition on mobile. The before we can make before hidden, and then on medium and up we make this before block, because we don't need to have those white lines, so we just as well remove them. And the same for the hover animations, they also only need to apply on medium and up. And also the hidden first images should only be applied on medium and up as well. And then we need to make this text position absolute also only on medium and up. And that will suddenly show things. And the reason is because before the image as well as the text was positioned absolute. So there was nothing taking up any space for this item to grow. Then I also see that this gap should also be from medium and up, and we should add a gap of 3 on mobile. And then for this image, the big width and height also only applies on medium and up. And we should actually make this a width of 24 and a height of auto, and then give this a right of 0, where this left only applies on mobile. And the same goes for the translate offset. So that way the image is moved to the right. Next, we also should make sure that this text is always visible. So this also only applies from medium and up. And the text should also be text small, and the 4XL should become a text large, and on medium only 4XL. We also need to add a padding to this text now. So padding 4, and that means on medium we need to add padding 0, otherwise this padding would have effect. And then we already have a responsive variant that is pretty similar to what Stripe built. And when we now go back and scale this up a little bit, everything should still look okay. And it does. And the reason there's no change is because we reused all of the styles and made them only medium and up. And I was also really careful that whatever we added, for example the padding, that I reset that on medium and up again, because otherwise this text would now be positioned differently. And with that, we came to the end of today's video. We built a carousel that's pretty similar to what Stripe built as well. Of course, all the real carousel interactivity of adding new slides and removing them is not something I've added, because then this would become a really big video. But the things I'm most excited about, simply these really smooth transitions when you hover over them, that's something that I really enjoy. And that's also something that I really like to teach you. So I hope that this is also something that you really enjoyed. And if so, please leave a like and a comment down below. And if you want me to help you learn even more around these topics, definitely check out my Discord via the link below as well. I would love to see you there. And like always, the link to the source code will be down in the description below. And if all goes well, you might be able to see this in the new Frontend playground. I really hope to also release that still together with this video. And please don't be too hard on me, it's just the version 0.1. But I think having all this together on one page, being able to use a demo, view the code, view the video, is super helpful. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next video.